Well, good morning, everyone, or just as likely good afternoon or good evening to all of you who are joining us, wherever you are joining us from. We are delighted to welcome you to this special event of the Hoover Project on China's global sharp power, where we will be presenting and discussing the final report of a project that we have had for more than a year now, examining China's sharp power in Africa. And that final report is entitled China's Sharp Power in Africa, a Handbook for Building National Resilience. I am Larry Diamond. I am a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, and it's my privilege to chair the Hoover Project on China's global sharp power with one of our speakers today and one of the co-authors of this extremely important and timely handbook, Dr. Glenn Tiffert. Glenn is one of the four individuals who we are privileged to have with us today at this special event. I will introduce them all in just a minute. Let me just say that this project on China's sharp power in Africa began with a series of intensive dialogues with approximately 25 African civil society leaders and journalists at the beginning of 2021. We were extremely privileged to undertake this project in close cooperation with the Ghana Center for Democratic Development. It's our honor to have its director, Kwasi Prempeh, with us today. It's been our honor to have the former Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs and our distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, Jendai Frazier, as another frequent participant in this project. And we are grateful to the Global Engagement Center of the Department of State for their support of this project. I want now, if I may, to more formally introduce our four panelists, beginning with the two co-authors of this report, and then our two commentators. In addition to co-chairing the Hoover Project on China's sharp power, Glenn Tiffert is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution and a historian of modern China. He works closely with government and civil society partners to document and build resilience. I hope you will hear that word resilience again and again in this hour, against authoritarian interference with democratic institutions. And he co-authored and edited two reports on risk in the research enterprise, including our recent book, Global Engagement, Rethinking Risk in the Research Enterprise. The second co-author of this outstanding handbook is Oliver McPherson Smith, who is a doctoral candidate in political science at the University of Oxford. His research explores the politics of the private sector in Africa and the Middle East. He received a master's degree in Middle Eastern Studies from Harvard, a bachelor's degree in land economy from the University of Cambridge, and he will soon be a PhD from Oxford and heading to Nigeria to observe and study the 2023 presidential elections. As I've already indicated, Jendai Frazier is our former Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs and former US Ambassador to South Africa. We are proud to have her now as the Dignan Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Hoover. She was a Distinguished Service Professor at Carnegie Mellon University's Heinz College, and we are also proud to say a PhD alumnus of political science from Stanford. Finally, we are just so pleased to have had the partnership of Kwasi Prempeh and his colleagues at the Ghana Center for Democratic Development. I consider Kwasi to be one of the most astute and forthright analysts and observers and commentators and leaders on African politics and civil society. He's also a lawyer by training with his JD from the Yale Law School, and has an MBA and Bachelor's of Science from Baylor University, Texas, and the University of Ghana, respectively. He's been a Reagan-Fussell Fellow at NED, National Endowment for Democracy, and was a founding member of the governing board of the Ghana Center for Democratic Development. And he's co-editor-in-chief of the center's Democracy Watch. So I think we are going to begin with Glenn to introduce the handbook and say a little bit more about the project. Then we'll go to Oliver, and then to our African colleague, Kwasi Prempeh, and finally to our distinguished former Assistant Secretary, Jendai Fraser. Glenn, please get us started.
Thank you very much, Larry, for that generous introduction. When we first began this program, our goal was really to understand how Africa engaged, or China engaged with Africa and other regions of the world. And more importantly, to learn from Africans in the field, what they were seeing in their backyards, and also how they were understanding it, what their perspectives and concerns about China's engagements with their countries were. So we pulled together a group of about 30 civil society leaders from about 24, 25 African nations. Originally, the program was intended to be an in-person program in Accra, and we were just in the midst of buying the plane tickets when COVID began. And so over the last 2 years, we've had to reinvent the program in a variety of ways and deliver it virtually, move very quickly and adapt. But in the end, I think we've learned so much from our African partners, and I can't underscore enough what Larry said about the pleasure of working with CDD, Kwasi, and his team. It's been a great honor. So let me get into the goals of this handbook. As I said, we did a lot of learning on different areas of China's engagements with Africa. The program was devised in a way that we would run seminars with global experts on various aspects of Chinese politics, China's technology policy, human rights, the United Front, China's economic policies around the world, so that our African participants could glean some of the China knowledge that we had. And then the second half of the program involved our African participants going to do field research in their own countries on areas that were relevant to them. For example, those who had demonstrated work in labor rights or elections or other aspects of journalism and media freedom went and developed local knowledge about these topics, which they then returned to us. We published a subset of those papers at the Hoover Institution in January, and I encourage you, they're downloadable, I encourage you to take a good look at them. But to dig into this handbook is a distillation of what we learned over our project. The goal really is to pull together some learning in a number of key sectors for African participants who would like to understand more about how China engages with sub-Saharan Africa, to be aware of the concerns, some of the problem areas, and to engage with China with their eyes wide open. We understand very much that China has a lot to offer to Africa. Africa's unmet needs with regard to infrastructure investment, Africa's desire for markets for its goods are very, very strong. China provides outlets for that which cannot be denied. And so the goal here really is to empower Africans with information to help them make better, wiser decisions, to ensure that their engagements with China benefit African peoples, and not just elites in Africa and in China. And so we essentially in this handbook unpacked a number of sectors: debt, infrastructure, trade, media freedom, and elite capture, and tried to generate the best data we could in a sort of thumbnail way to bring people up to speed very quickly, and then suggest recommendations for how Africans might engage with China on a more equitable footing. So let me very quickly get into some of that. And I'll do about half of the handbook, and then I'll pass the baton over to Oliver, and who'll carry us over the line. Hannah, could you please bring up the slides? So a lot of China's engagements with Africa in recent years have revolved around the question of debt. Among Africa's leading development partners, China is unique in this respect. Its overseas development finance is built on mountains of debt. During the first 4 years of the Belt and Road Initiative from 2013 to 2017, China issued 31 times more loans than grants across the world. And China's development assistance in particular has been keyed towards infrastructure. China's development finance institutions provided 2.5 times more finance for infrastructure than the development finance institutions of all other nations combined. They've lent approximately $153 billion officially to African governments and state-owned enterprises from 2000 to 2019, with the amount peaking in 2016, but then starting to fall off precipitously. So of that approximately $153 billion, 2/3 of it went just to 3 sectors: transport, power, and mining. And so you had a parade of large, expensive projects designed, managed, and often executed by conglomerates and workers from China. China's lending practices differ really from the rest of the world. They don't participate in the Paris Club of International Lending. They don't adopt the conventions of transparency with regard to lending. In fact, much of their lending is cloaked not only with secrecy on the Chinese side, but also secrecy on the part of their African partners, who are contractually obligated to keep the terms of the contracts confidential. And this allows an end run around a lot of democratic processes like parliamentary scrutiny, scrutiny by the media over the terms of the engagements, and it feeds extraordinary corruption and nepotism in the countries in which China operates. And this is of great concern in countries that are struggling to fight corruption. But beyond that, because of the hidden nature of a lot of this lending, there could be $200 billion in extra loans that are simply off the books and hidden. And if you take the loans into account that are going to non-sovereign borrowers, like state-owned enterprises, for example, in African countries, some estimates put the level of debt at $385 billion. And the damage to African countries is substantial. African countries are now struggling to service this debt, and it's mortgaging their futures. Debt service for it is going to limit their abilities to invest in public education and in public health and other unmet needs in their countries. So this is of tremendous concern. But beyond just debt, there are other areas too that are, actually, next slide, please. This gives a snapshot of the debt load across Africa. And you can see in the dark blue, these are the countries that range in total debt as a percentage of their GDP to Africa, 15% to 69%. Angola and Djibouti are the leaders here, and largely because they've financed excessive lending from China against their oil revenues. Angola in particular is struggling now to service this debt. But other countries, for example, like Zambia, are also struggling under the debt, and Tanzania as well. And so that gives a sort of rough snapshot of the debt load across Africa. Rather uneven, some countries experiencing it much more than others. But beyond the question of debt also, we wanted to look into technology. China provides a tremendous amount of cutting-edge technology to Africa. Many of you are probably aware, for example, of the competition between the United States and China over Huawei and its 5G networks. African wireless networks have adopted Chinese technology widely, and this has brought African consumers and people on the street tremendous benefits, inexpensive handsets, reliable mobile technology. But along with that technology comes a model of techno-authoritarianism that China is also exporting into Africa that is of great concern. And safe cities are a principal way in which this enters Africa. Huawei and other Chinese conglomerates are selling packages of safe city technologies to African nations, financed through, again, debt. We looked at a couple of examples, Uganda, for example, and Mauritius, and we found that in many cases, these safe city technologies, while they're being touted as crime control measures, are being used in ways that limit free expression, that are used for surveillance of dissidents or people who express opinions that are contrary to those of the ruling party and ruling governments. And so this raises profound concerns with regard to democratic processes and civil rights and civil liberties in countries. And China doesn't really attach any strings to these projects because China doesn't offer its own people the civil liberties that are at issue here. And so this is of tremendous concern for African civil society participants who can benefit from these technologies, but have to be alert to some of the downsides to them. And so the technology dimension is extremely important here. Next slide, please. But beyond that, Africa is also developing its internet governance and internet technology infrastructure with a great deal of Chinese assistance. This isn't just hardware. This is also the software, not literally the software code, but also the regulatory infrastructure that governs China's internet approaches to internet governance are also being exported into Africa. And so a number of nations, including, for example, Nigeria and Tanzania, have consulted Chinese experts on how China has adopted a regulatory approach to controlling social media, to guiding traditional media. And so in 2021, this is just a list of the internet shutdowns across Africa, largely facilitated by Chinese technology and Chinese guidance. And in fact, Nigeria stands out because 2 years ago, Nigeria's First Lady very famously referred to the fact that if China, a nation of 1.3 or 4 billion people, can control its social media space, then surely Nigeria could too. And then just last year, Nigeria banned Twitter for 222 days simply because they dropped a controversial tweet by Nigeria's president. So again, this gets to free expression and the regulation of social media spaces that are critical to democratic processes. So that's also a section in the report. And then finally, we had sections on media freedom and elite capture. You know, China is playing in a very large way in African media markets at a time when Western media firms are largely retreating from the continent simply because their cost structures don't support it. CGTN, China Daily, Xinhua are big players now with headquarters, regional hubs in Nairobi, and they're funding very large newsrooms that are staffed by Chinese and African reporters that generate programming for African and Chinese markets. But African reporters will say that working for these Chinese firms, while they're able to achieve very high production value and learn new skills, they're troubled by the fact that their stories are censored in Beijing, that they're not able to report on issues that Beijing finds extremely sensitive, such as human rights, censorship, elections, religious diversity, questions of that nature. And so Africans who work for these news organizations are forced to tell African stories on China's terms. And this is of great concern too, because China brings such resources into the market that it can distort African views of the world. And in particular, China subsidizes these news organs, which makes it very difficult for Western firms that are market-oriented to compete against them. And so Western firms and freer media organizations from around the world are being shut out of some of these markets. China in particular also pursues exclusive licensing deals to ensure that its content is distributed widely across Africa. And these are, again, are subsidized by the Chinese government. So that's of tremendous concern. And then I'll finally close with a few remarks about elite capture. China has been extremely generous in funding programs of short-term study programs in China for African elites and African professionals from a range of professions. Government bureaucrats, for example, who are interested in the governance of the media, who are interested in technology governance, also government, public health officials as well, to study how China does what it does. China also has offered up to 50,000 scholarships to African students to study in China. China has been more generous than virtually any other country in the world in this respect. And this has brought it a tremendous amount of goodwill and influence around the world too, and in its efforts to sell China's model around the world. And the message here tends to be that China has achieved success in economic growth without adopting the institutions of liberal rule of law and support for liberal human rights. And well, if it worked for China, then perhaps it could work for other countries too. And for African civil society and for civil society activists anywhere in the world, this is a tremendous concern, because China is selling a model to elites and governments that says you do not need to respect electoral democracy, you don't need to have a free media sector, you can have growth and wealth without any of those things. And for those who care about electoral accountability and holding their officials subject to votes, this is alarming. And so it's something that sneaks in behind all of the programming that China is offering to elites in emerging markets around the world. And so with that, let me hand the microphone over to my co-author, Oliver, who will close out the rest of the report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Glenn and Larry, for those generous introductions and for detailing the first part of the report there, Glenn. I will, in an effort to complement what you've talked about, I'll talk more about the natural resource industry and the development of infrastructure in Africa. Throughout this handbook, we weave a variety of different themes, two of which I think are quite important, possibly the most important, are how can we define sharp power? What does it look like on the ground in sub-Saharan Africa? And then secondly, what can civil society do when it sees sharp power in play? I think it's important to reiterate that transparent and competitive investment deals that respect local laws are good and welcome. In the natural resource industry, it provides capital that can be reinvested in health and education, and better quality infrastructure lowers the cost of doing business. But it's also important to recall that today, in every single jurisdiction across sub-Saharan Africa, to some degree or another, there are laws on the books that seek to protect human rights, workers' rights, protect the environment, or to inhibit corruption. The issue is when we see a distinction between the deals that are signed on paper and the way in which they are implemented. When that implementation differs significantly, there is an imposition of hidden, opaque, or unagreed upon costs. And that comes through regulatory non-compliance, disregard for contractual terms, or repeated criminal violations. Throughout the handbook, we detail examples of these costs. Geographically, these costs are incredibly broad. They include the environmental degradation in the South Sudanese oil industry, abusive labor practices in the mining industry of the DRC and also in Ghana in the gold industry, the unregulated and untransparent exploitation of fishing resources in the Gulf of Guinea, and even the facilitation of corruption in the Zambian construction industry. These issues and these non-compliance all impose costs upon citizens, upon communities, upon the environment, business, and upon governments, both in terms of foregone fiscal revenues, as well as the cost of corruption. So if we can recognize what sharp power looks like on the ground in sub-Saharan Africa, we can next perhaps question what civil society can do about it. Throughout the handbook, we catalogue various examples of civil society using their own political and legal institutions to push back against the corrosive, sharp power that comes from certain entities based in the People's Republic of China. These examples are similarly as broad as the costs, but they're also temporally broad. And what I mean by that is, at every stage of project development, from its conception right up to its completion and further on, civil society has demonstrated its ability to push back against these costs using their given context and on their own terms. Again, we detail civil society's activities, whether it be pushing back against some of the terms around the Bagamoyo port in Tanzania, or questioning the costs of the Lagos-Ibadan railway in Nigeria, or the way in which the Tenke-Fungurume mine in the DRC is being run. Even after a project has completely come to fruition, like the Mombasa to Nairobi railway in Kenya, we see civil society organizations using domestic legal institutions like the courts to question the way in which these projects have been developed. As we draw from all these different examples spread across sub-Saharan Africa, I think I speak on both behalf of Glenn and I when I say that we hope that the whole of this handbook is greater than the sum of its parts. And by drawing these diverse examples together, civil society across sub-Saharan Africa can take both inspiration, but more importantly, examples of ways in which they can push back against sharp power to attenuate some of these costs on their own terms. African civil society has agency at every step of the way, and hopefully by collecting and collating these examples, they will be able to, moving forward, be incredibly vigilant for how these costs are emanating and for whom they are benefiting. In the interest of time, I will wrap up there and thank you all again for joining us, and I'll pass it back to Glenn.
Thank you, Oliver. I want to underscore what Oliver said. African agency is key here. China will not look out for African interests. China is working in Africa largely to pursue its own interests, but Africans have tremendous power here. Every engagement that we catalog in the pages involved African agency and negotiation. And while we catalog examples in which the benefits benefited just a small number of people and they compromised sovereignty or sacrificed public interest, there were numerous counterexamples to point the way towards more effective responses. And our goal here is really to provide the information to empower Africans to make wiser decisions. You know, democracies prosper with vigorous investments in their foundations. And so we encourage governments in the region to train officials at all levels in recognizing, resisting, and building resilience against power, not just from China, sharp power, not just from China, but from all of Africa's international partners. And those nations with the greatest capacity to defend their sovereignty, impartially monitor and enforce their own laws, and resist state capture by powerful factions or parties can give technical assistance to others. One of the takeaways from this report is that the countries with the strongest democratic institutions not only perform better for their own people, but they perform better at resisting sharp power from external actors as well. And so the key is to build the democratic institutions within government, but also in civil society, to ensure that countries function not only better for their own people, but with regard to external organizations. And so this requires a constellation of courts, parliaments, journalists, anti-corruption campaigners, environmental activists, labor rights organizations, and working together really to prevail over parochial interests and ensure that transparency, rule of law, sovereignty, and public accountability win the day. And broadening this space, you know, through support of genuinely independent civic groups, research, education is key here, because sharp power really flourishes in darkness and ignorance. And so we encourage platforms for shared learning to take place among Africans and networking among African organizations to share knowledge from one country to another. They are stronger together. Those constrained from covering local examples of sharp power can expose them in neighboring jurisdictions, and they can work with global partners, bilateral partners, multilateral agencies to complement local initiatives and develop and fill in gaps in skills and knowledge. And so our goal really here is not to encourage Africa to shut out China, by no means at all. China has a tremendous amount to offer Africa, but for them to engage with China in smarter, wiser ways that ensure that they benefit the peoples of Africa. And so with that, I thank you and I turn it over to Larry again. Oh, and one final remark. The handbook actually is downloadable from hoover.org for those of you who are eager to look at it.
Right, good. Well, you have already been looking at the Q&A and saw the most important question that was asked, how is the handbook available? Glenn, maybe you could type the answer in the chat for the audience if they have access to it.
I gladly will.
Type the location of the handbook. Among the civil society organizations that we need more of to build resilience are think tanks, none better than the Ghana Center for Democratic Development. But Kwasi, if you'll permit me, since we had an original order, let's go to Jendai Fraser, our former Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs first. And then, Kwasi, we're going to be extremely keen to hear from you. Jendai, please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. And for me, I'm in Nairobi, so good evening to all of you, but morning for you in West Coast and afternoon for others. One, let me just say that I thought this was an excellent paper. I think it really pulls out the themes and the research that was done by the civil society participants. My comments over the next 8 minutes or so, if I get to 8 minutes, will really be about this concept of sharp power. I think it's extremely important in differentiating between what we're talking about in terms of China's engagement with Africa versus US engagement with Africa. And I think that's some of the questions that have come up in the Q&A. First, in terms of definition, in the paper, sharp power involves norms and practices that burrow deeply and deceptively into the soft tissue of democracies to subvert and sway them through the methods that are covert, coercive, and corrupting. And I think we need to really hold on to that definition. And for me, the key differentiator that's so important here is that what China is promoting is authoritarian regimes effectively. And what the West and the United States is promoting is democratic regimes. And that's important because it's not just about the day-to-day engagement. It's really, frankly, a global struggle over what are going to be the rules of the international system. Are we actually going to be supporting authoritarian governments, which I know Africa doesn't want? You know, Africans have fought for their freedom. This is a continent of young people who want to be able to express themselves freely. And so in the long battle, Africa's, what it's exporting does not and will not take hold on this continent. So that I'm very clear about. I think that it's important to actually go through some of the different sections briefly that Glenn and Oliver raised and that came up during the dialogue with African civil society to look at some of the ways in which it's covert, coercive, and corrupting. And I'm only gonna really highlight issues, not go into great depth about them, but when we look at the question of the debt and the debt trap, yes, it's important that Africa has infrastructure. I, for one, want my internet to stay on during this program. You know, I like to go up country on smooth roads. You know, I like the infrastructure development that China has so heavily invested, but really not invested so much. It's debt. And the question is Africa's future one in which it's a debt development model? I don't think so. Particularly when you look at the second area, which is trade. And when you look at that trade balance, yes, China has made huge inroads. It is the major partner for Africa, but if that trade is unequal between raw materials versus manufactured or value-added goods, then Africa is always going to have a trade deficit, right? Which is going to be financed through debt, which is going to keep it dependent globally. And so that's the problem. Now, that's not so different than the United States and the Western countries, quite frankly, because the trade relationship of Africa has significantly been raw material exports and import of manufactured goods. And so both the Western countries and China need to look at ways in which, and Africans, more importantly than both the West and China, frankly, Africans need to look at ways in which that value add can come in so that they can have a better trade relationship globally. If we look at natural resources, we've talked, and Oliver, I think you did a wonderful job just now of talking about the ways in which the exploitation of natural resources have been coercive and corrupting and killing people. As we said in South Sudan with oil spills. Actually, many of our industries in the West don't have a great record either. If we think about Shell in Nigeria, for example, but the difference is the civil society in America has pushed for things like Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. American companies can no longer have these contracts with hidden clauses like we still have in China, which effectively says the civil society and the parliaments of these countries are pushed out of that relationship. It's the same with construction contracts as well, where they are opaque and corrupting. So we all here love the Nairobi to Mombasa railroad, but when is the country ever going to be able to pay that back? There was so much corruption embedded in that deal. And as I think the paper rightly states, it's mortgaging Africa's future, right? So yes, we're getting infrastructure development here, but at what cost? And then when we look at technology, which is one of the areas that I think I'm most fascinated about, and as a person who does security, I do worry about terror threats in this region. I do worry about crime. And so, the idea of smart cities, I personally was quite naive. I thought, well, it makes sense to get cameras. We have cameras all over the United States, but it's not embedded in any kind of legal framework. It's not embedded in any kind of governance framework. And when Huawei goes to Mauritius and does an unsolicited bid, and then the prime minister of Mauritius says that he can't actually share the nature of the contract with his parliament because it's national security, and it's actually being used to look for dissidents, then, we're not, facial recognition, surveillance of the population. This is, again, an authoritarian and an oppressive, not, frankly, a national security and crime fighting initiatives. And so I think we have to look very carefully at that. And I think one of the things that the paper said that was most important to me on the technology side was the question of the data is one of Africa's greatest endowments. And how is the governance of the data that's being collected through this Chinese technology? How is it benefiting African citizens? And how are African leaders and civic leaders and government leaders going to make sure that privacy is respected? I think that's an extremely important question, and it's just the theft of another resource. Now, I do sit here in Nairobi, and I like to watch all the TV stations. I've been watching carefully how they have covered the Ukraine-Russia war, the Russian war against Ukraine. And one of the channels I watch is China Global Television Network. I watch South Africa Broadcasting Network. I watch Al Jazeera. And what I find very interesting is exactly as Glenn said, which is there's control over what the narrative is about that conflict. But even more interesting to me was late at night, they will put such anti-negative American programs about America on the network, right? I mean, really hard-hitting programs, looking at sort of the underbelly of America. For example, saying America is not a real democracy, because if you look at what the legislatures are doing, or across our country, they're cutting back on voting rights. African Americans are so many in jail, just really hammering to the audience across Africa, because this is on DSTV, which is all across Africa, that America itself is not a democracy. So don't follow their model, or don't listen to their preaching about the importance of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, participation in elections. On the cultivation of African elites, I have to say that this is an area where the United States simply just needs to do better. You can't really blame them on FOCAC, right? The Forum on China-Africa Engagement. That the United States now has, from President Obama, has the Africa Leaders Forum. It's extremely important. President Biden has also said it. But what it really does mean is that the United States needs to spend a lot more time engaging with African leaders. I think the Africa-Europe forum that just happened in March is an example, an important example, but being able to build a sense of mutual interests and being able to understand what Africa's priorities are, so that engagement is indeed mutual. So I think those are some of the areas, but what I'd like to just end on is I did look at, I thought it was very interesting, because I know for a fact that China is trying to cultivate African elites, mainly because they want their influence and their power of numbers in multilateral fora. And so going back to the Ukraine, the Russia war against Ukraine, I looked at the African votes, because that's one of China's efforts, is to try to get those 54 countries to vote in their favor. At the Security Council, the 3 African members, which were Gabon, Ghana, and Kenya, all voted on the resolution with the United States and others, basically the 8 other countries, against Russia. Russia basically vetoed on that resolution, which then led to the emergency meeting at the General Assembly. And in the emergency meeting at the General Assembly, Africa represents about 27 or basically 28% of the total votes at the General Assembly. The 54 countries are 28% of the votes. Of those votes that voted again, basically with the United States against Russia, I'm talking about Russia, but we know that Russia and China are aligned in this effort to basically move countries towards a more authoritarian practices. 51.85% voted with the United States again. So I think that it's important to say that even with all of China's cultivation towards this more authoritarian model and this more authoritarian global system, which is where the real competition is, African countries are continuing to reflect a interest. And I think CDD Ghana, I'm going to let Kwesi talk about this a bit more if he does, but CDD Ghana has done a lot of survey research, which shows that the sentiment on this continent is very much more in favor of more democratic governance. And so I think at the end of the day, this program, and particularly its help for civil society to really look carefully at what the nature of the engagement is with China, is part of building that capacity, building that strength, and building that awareness to be able to, civil society engaging legislatures, parliaments, courts, to stand up to a lot of these corrupting and coercive methods that China is embedding through sharp power. So with that, I will stop and turn it over to Kwesi.
Well, you've just given a beautiful articulation of a lot of what democratic resilience is, and we're now staring at one embodiment of it in CDD Ghana and Kwasi Prempeh. So over to you, Kwasi.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Larry, Glenn, Oliver, Emmy, all of you at Hoover for this wonderful initiative. We really benefited a lot at CDD from our collaboration with you on this project. And I think I speak for nearly all of my fellow African participants in this, in the series of seminars that we had over the course of these 2 years. For me, I think, coming from the African civil society angle, not just general civil society, but pro-democracy civil society, I think the question of China is an important one for us to put on the table. First, because at the start of the third wave, when the third wave of democratization hit the African shore, China was not really a significant presence on the continent at the time. The international environment generally for democracy and democratization was very hospitable, and it enabled civil society groups like CDD and others to actually emerge to push for democratic reform. Certainly over the last 30 years, over the 30 years since the 1990s, much has changed, including significantly with respect to China's presence on the continent. So I think it's important that we take stock of this significant change in the international environment, international context pertaining to democracy in Africa. That from not being a significant player at the beginning, China has now had a growing and in some cases outsized presence in the African economic and political space. And so it's important for us to ask, how is this going to affect democracy and democratization on the continent? And in fact, Afrobarometer has taken quite some interest in this subject, and in the course of its surveys has sometimes actually posed this question about China's influence on the continent. In the most recent one, between 2019 and 2021, the results show an interesting pattern that while Africans continue to express strong preference for democracy, which has held, that preference for democracy has held quite strong over from almost round 1 to round 8 of Afrobarometer. Increasingly, though, you also find that significant numbers, large numbers of Africans are also hold quite from somewhat positive to very positive views of China, right? So you do have that interesting coupling of a preference for democracy and yet also a positive outlook or a positive view on China. And I think some of that actually goes to what Glenn, some of the points that Glenn mentioned about the goodwill that has been purchased significantly from things like large numbers of Africans on scholarship in China, the very very significant brick and mortar gifts to African publics, National Theatre in Ghana built by the Chinese, some of these kinds of monuments in the various countries. So there is a sense in which, in fact, in terms of the visible part of Chinese presence in many African countries, the average African on the street probably is inclined to see it positively, as Afrobarometer is telling us. But we also know that over the course of the same period that we've been measuring African sentiments, Afrobarometer has also noted something interesting, that Africans have a very, again, strong demand for democracy, but fairly weak supply of it. They're not getting as much from their elected governments and leads as they would want. So there is a sense that, in some, you could read this to mean that democracy, the democratic dividends are not being shared, equitably on the continent between elites and the publics. or that the democratic dividends are not actually being enjoyed by the larger populace. So whether it's political and goods like civil and political liberties, or economic material gains, that Africans express some sense of disappointment with the elite. So again, there is some sense in which elites, African regimes might feel a bit insecure and would need a bit of shoring up, some support. And of course, we've also seen recent democratic backsliding on the continent. And this is, I think, where the sharp power idea really is helpful to add another dimension to the picture, which is not, the one that's very visible. I mean, the idea that sharp power is subterranean, it's covert, it's not, basically there for you to normally see or feel, but it's working its way through elite networks, and it's working outside of the full glare of democratic institutions and the like. I think it's an important addition to the picture, so that we get a fuller picture of how China is actually operating in the political and economic space in Africa. And I think here, Chinese sharp power, I think, manages to exploit, certain really key characteristics of the African state and political economy at the present time. So the African assets, what Africans have basically to offer. Natural resources have been mentioned. Certainly, that's one key African assets that, from the study, we get that Chinese sharp power really exploits this. Importantly, Jendai has talked about Africa's numbers politically in terms of multilateral institutions. It's another major asset that I think Chinese sharp power has targeted. And then you look at African needs. Again, all these go together. We have assets, but we also have needs, huge needs in infrastructure, huge needs in finance, how to actually work the resources that are on the ground, and also how to provide infrastructure. And then I think the third characteristic is Africa's weaknesses. Really, like I said, democracy is fairly infant on the continent. A number of institutions remain weak. Regulatory capacity is weak and vulnerable to capture. Bureaucratic capacity, bureaucratic integrity, fairly weak. So at the institutional level, there are huge weaknesses that I think again enable the ideas of sharp power to really work its way. And then you also have other vulnerabilities, security vulnerabilities, not just regime security, but sometimes real security in terms of territorial integrity, but regime security clearly, and also our technological gaps. And when you put all these three together, I think that's really where sharp power really actually, by taking advantage of these various characteristics, the assets, the needs, as well as the vulnerabilities, it really poses a huge challenge for African civil society. How do you counter this? This is why I think the handbook is extremely useful, because it does lay out for us a number of, because it collects cases and examples from various African countries, as the project did. This idea of bringing all of us together to be able to share experiences from various countries, so that we would actually learn from each other exactly how sharp power was operating, I think was extremely useful. And the handbook does highlight a number of these cases, but also a number of these ways in which African civil societies have been successful in some cases at actually dealing with this problem, because it does in fact represent a huge problem. When you have assets to offer, but you have needs to exploit those assets, you have huge needs in infrastructure, and you have institutional weaknesses. And somebody else comes in the picture and says, look, I'll work all of these things together for you. I mean, it's really an attractive offer. And I think that's why it's become challenging. And of course, to the extent that it's also subterranean, it's also covert, it's not, there are brick and mortar things that we can easily see. That kind of influence leading to elite capture most of the time is presented some real challenges for us in civil society. So I think for us, this new additional dimension, additional information out there, additional knowledge really is very useful. And also to the extent that that knowledge includes how, for example, even, I mean, the example of the Kenyan Law Society representing civil society to actually bring a legal challenge that was successful to a particular contract that had not gone through local procurement laws, right? So it's important for us to know these examples of ways in which, by sharing experiences within African civil societies, national civil society, we can actually help to counter some of these influences. Because, as you rightly said, yes, the needs are real. I mean, African societies have these needs. The elites feel the pressure. You know, part of why people feel that the democracy may not be delivering as much as they want is these unmet expectations. And so the elites feel pressure, they feel vulnerable. And, you know, so it's really a dilemma that I think is widely shared. And I think that the real virtue of this whole initiative, as well as the handbook, is that it provides us something of a toolkit, lessons, and yet some tools by which we can actually help civil society in Africa generally address this challenge. So I commend you, Glenn and Oliver, for this book, and commend Larry and Hoover for actually making this a success. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, it's been wonderful having you as a partner. We only have a few minutes left. I'm going to pose one question and ask you each to just kind of give about a 1-minute response. I'm going to work more or less backwards. One of our most devoted participants in this dialogue over the last 1 year plus, Agnes Ibo, has basically said, well, it's all fine and good to say we've got to strengthen civil society. Civil society has to be in the lead, but really, why not focus more on the role of African governments themselves, that are the ones that are, you know, not holding up the initiative here and are being penetrated and corrupted. Let me say that I think we face a dilemma here, which Kwasi and Jendai, if you put their remarks together, have spoken to. On the one hand, Africans have a certain admiration for China, its ability to get things done, to build infrastructure, and its developmental success. On the other hand, what they want is China's developmental success, not its authoritarianism. Jendai has made that very clear, and the Afrobarometer findings made that very clear. The whole idea of resilience involves robustness, institutional vigor, institutional strength. And the single thing that most impressed me since we started this project with the initial conversations, I think in January of last year, is how much the project of giving Africa the ability, or partnering with Africa to develop the ability to defend its sovereignty against China's sharp power, involves the same things we've been trying to do to lift up and promote democracy and good governance. So I'd like to close, beginning with you, Jendai, and then going to Kwasi, and then to Oliver, and then to Glenn, each of you 1 minute only. If you've got one specific idea that could be done to build democratic, accountable governance, resilience in Africa that would contribute to giving the African continent greater immunity in the face of this challenge. Jendai?
I'm going to be very brief, and I don't know what the one thing is, but the one thing that I would say is it has to be youth-oriented, and it has to fight against apathy in youth if they're pushed out of, you know, being brought in and being participants. And so the youth are key.
Kwasi?
Yeah, I think you know, I think I'll have to go back to the point about empowering civil society, especially in its ability to engage democratic institutions like parliaments. I mean, the real issue is that a number of parliaments are very weak. Their oversight of executive, their oversight of international agreements and contracts. Some of these agreements actually do go through, nominally appear to go through Parliament, but basically almost are not even revealed to parliaments themselves. Sometimes we even have more information about some of these contracts than parliaments themselves, right? So trying to get civil society to work together with some of the champions in parliament to really get a lot more transparency out there so that African citizens can evaluate these kinds of deals for themselves. I think once information gets out there, once you have a lot more transparency out there, then people can make decisions for themselves. Otherwise, sometimes it would appear that this is just counter-Western propaganda, right? But when people really have the information themselves about these deals, then they can actually inform themselves better. And then sometimes you would see, people say no to some of these deals once their details become known to the public. So reinvigorating civil society, trying to make sure that we're better empowered to deal with democratic institutions, to bring more transparency to some of these networks and deals. I think it's an important part of the solution.
Excellent. Okay, over to you, Oliver.
I'm going to piggyback off both of those points and say young people, information, social media has been fantastic and is a real help. 50 years ago, if Indigenous workers, local workers were abused, how would we know? If you can't get it into the newspapers, if you can't get it on TV, you can't share that information. You can't pressure your government or your representatives, the bureaucracy. By sharing information through social media, publicly, but also privately, messaging apps like WhatsApp have been key to sharing what's really going on, particularly among young people.
Glenn, before I thank our staff and our two project sponsors, if you could offer your thoughts and any final words.
Sure, just a couple of quick points. I want to echo, I think, what others have said about creating networks that share information. But I think really here the key is that Africans need to lead. This is a question of them defining their future. And to the extent that Africa's multilateral partners can play a role in that, I think what we can do is help create platforms for sharing of knowledge so that Africans can share knowledge among each other and step forward to kind of control the choices that they make. And this is ultimately about their destinies. And so I think supporting not just sharing of information, but networks that help make that information actionable would be key here. And this is how strengths from one country can be lent to countries that need capacity in those areas. Africa has so much to offer itself internally. And then secondly, with regard to the United States, I really think that the United States and Africa's traditional Western development partners do a good job on meeting basic needs and humanitarian needs with their development assistance. But what we need to do more of is deliver the goods that Africa aspires to have, to meet Africa's wants and desires. China has been doing this very well by dangling shiny, bright objects in front of Africans who want bridges, who want modern buildings, who want concert halls and mobile infrastructure. US development institutions and Africa's Western partners should be doing more of this to be helping Africa build its future and not just, meet basic developmental needs.
Great. And I will now offer my 2 cents. Number one, we've got to re-engage with Africa in a much more comprehensive way. Point Jendai passionately made as both U.S. Ambassador to South Africa and as Assistant Secretary. Indeed, she felt it so strongly, she built a home in Africa. And it's great to have you coming from there. Secondly, I think our message has to be, look, don't allow a new generation of neocolonialism in Africa. We're not asking you to sign on with the United States of America or quote the West. Just defend your sovereignty. against all actors who might corrupt it or subvert it or demand non-transparency and compromises of your sovereignty. All we need is a level playing field in which Africans lead, as all of you said, and defend their sovereignty. And I think there'll be a chance for Africa to develop and for Western investors to have a fair shot if they can compete. And third, I'll add to my wish list for institutional investment, massive investments in independent media and investigative journalism in Africa. I think it became very clear in our work over the life of this project that this is a very important priority. This leads me then to thank our immediate institutional sponsor, which has played such an important role in trying to build a lot of these institutions on the ground, the Institute for War and Peace Reporting. Thank you for your partnership. And the Global Engagement Center of the State Department. Thank you for your partnership and engagement, quite literally. Thank you, Oliver and Glenn, for producing this wonderful report. Jendai, for your participation throughout in all of our sessions and as an advisor to this project. Kwasi, to you and your colleagues at the Ghana Center for Democratic Development, you will be, I think, inevitably in the lead as one of the most important civil society institutions on the African continent. And we thank our Hoover colleagues for arranging this session and so many of the others over the course of this. Betsy Phillips and her team at Hoover Events, and today Hannah Johnson. Thank you all for joining us. We have put the URL for the report in the chat, but if you can't copy it or click on it, just Google the title of the report, China's Sharp Power in Africa, a Handbook for Building National Resilience. And I'm quite sure that the first thing that will come up in your search engine is our handbook. Thank you all for joining us and have a good day.